Pewny błąd ci wyskoczył. We have a little technical difficulties. Poleciałeś jeszcze kawałek. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It seems that everything is fine now. Yeah, we had a little technical difficulties at the very beginning. Sorry for that. Now everything should be fine. So yeah. Hello and welcome to another DaVinci technical webinar. The previous one was about documentation. This one is about comments, which is technically two different topics, but quite similar because both are about understanding the code with not with the code itself, but with the natural human language. So it was kind of given that after documentation we will also tackle comments. Today is we're gonna talk about when, why, and how. So the most I would say the most basics of questions, but it turns out that those questions actually are kind of problematic for people on the development side of things. Turns out that even though the topic of comments is pretty easy in and of itself, people struggle to understand it even on the most basic level. So, which is why we're gonna have this webinar today. Yeah, quick introduction because last time we didn't do that, and I thought that maybe I should do it again. My name is Łukasz. I'm a self-taught developer. I've been working on the front-end side of things for the last 7+. It's almost 8 years at this point. Time flies very fast. Yeah, I have some experience with working on e-commerce projects, on web apps, on game dev, on mobile projects, so all kind of stuff. Also on backend a little bit. And this is not very important, but I am a history major, which might explain why I'm talking about not the code itself, but features around the code. Because let's face it, we can have a perfectly working code without comments. We can have a perfectly working code without documentation. So those are, I would say, additional features of our languages that are usable but are not really necessary for our projects to work. But at the same time, the documentation and comments are about human readable language, about natural language, which is something that history major probably would be more interested in. So, which is why another reason why we are even talking about this. Okay, so a quick refresher. What are even comments in general? So the comments are just pieces of text that are not compiled, not interpreted by the software that are going through source files in order to compile or read the source code. Basically, this is text that is ignored by the compiler. One thing I'm saying text because technically every source file, CPP files, C files, PHP files, JS files, TS files, whatever, are text files underneath. The fact that the extension is different means just different software will interpret those files differently, and that's basically about it. You can technically have a JS code in txt file, read that file via Node, and then parse it or compile it using specific tools. All of that will be fine. So yeah, we are basically saying to the compiler that this specific piece of code, or rather text between those specific characters, should not be parsed. So, and there are comments, multi-line comments, so-called. There are single-line comments. All of that is based only on the characters used before the text. And basically in every modern language, modern languages, and most of the older ones, I would assume, also have some kind of the comment syntax. That syntax can be very, very different for every language. Sorry, HTML is not a language, but it uses arrows, for example. I believe C C also uses stars. So for every language, there will be probably some differences in syntax, but the idea is basically the same. Just tells compiler to not take that line on lines into the account. Now there is also very specific line in this example, the line with the on the third third line actually, the param value. Now at character there, it's not a part of the syntax. I believe there is no language that uses at character for its comment syntax. It's more of a convention, naming convention. And for this language, for JS, not for JS, but not JS specifically, because Java also uses it, if I remember correctly, and also I believe C-style languages, because it's a convention for telling the additional tools that this is a comment about this specific line, this specific function or method or something, and with the param or other keywords, we can basically create a documentation or the instruction for that specific function. So we can have add param that will describe a parameter. We can have, for example, add since to describe when that specific method was created, and when we have a tool that will and there are tools that will create documentation from those comments using this syntax basically. But yeah, that's only a convention. It's not something related to the language itself. And that's basically it. Okay, so if you go through, if you are a member of programming groups for the beginners, or if you go through the web searching for information, you will probably find a lot of blog posts about why and how comments are evil, or maybe even unnecessary to exist. I mean, not even not unnecessary, that those should not even exist in the code. I've met quite a lot of people who have this opinion, and I've read quite a lot of articles about that. Not even that the comments are bad, you should avoid them, but the comments are bad and you should never use them ever again. Now, why that approach to the part of the language, because comments are a part of the language, why this approach even exists? Now, I think that in this specific case, Uncle Bob is to blame, because Uncle Bob is a very prolific part of the programming community, is a very famous and influential part of the community. And in 2008, he published a book called Clean Code. This is also a book that you will see on a lot of programmers' reading list. A lot of newbie programmers will be told to read that specific book because it will increase the quality of their code. And since the quote states that comments are at best unnecessary evil, that there is very little place for discussion. The comments are not good, period. It's what Uncle Bob says. And considering that his argument is pretty recent, I would say it's also on a lot of people's mind. A lot of people, and because probably a lot of people also took that as by face value, because, as I said, a very prolific, very important part of the programming community said that comments are evil, therefore they are probably evil. But there is another layer to all of this. I mean, because Uncle Bob wasn't the first probably who said that comments are evil, but I would assume that he is the first in the modern time who said it loud enough for others to take notice. But if we go back to 1975, the Mythical Man Month, the collection of essays by Fred Brooks about software development, was published. And this specific quote is from the part about good practices. As you can see, this is the point 11. Use line comments or remark anything that is not obvious. So in 75, Fred Brooks said, comment everything that is not obvious. In 2008, Uncle Bob said, comments are evil, don't use them, basically. So there was a little, I would say, little shift. But as you can see, also there is that little part, that second part. If the techniques above, so points 1 to 8, about let's say clean code, although that term wasn't used by the Fred Brooks in his book. So if the previous 10 techniques for making code clean will be used, then comments will be short and fewer. So so when Uncle Bob is saying comments are necessary, even you shouldn't use them, Fred Brooks says use them, but for very specific situations. So there is two approaches for this specific problem. But from my perspective, and I believe this is the correct, I don't want to say I believe this, I want to say believe this correct perspective, but I believe it's more, let's say, moderate perspective. Comments are just tools. Yes, those are those are just part of the JavaScript specification, something that can be used some specific cases. Yes, just like generators or let's say sets and maps are specific tools for specific jobs, just the same goes for comments. And just like any tool, tools are not inherently good or bad. They are good or bad for specific jobs. And I believe the problem exists because people uses and have been using comments for the purposes that comments were not designed for. And because there was overuse of that, then comments get a bad reputation, and now we are at the point when comments are considered by some people harmful, even though itself those are not. Those are, as I said, just text that is ignored by the compiler. That's basically it. So let's go through some specific examples of why people think that comments are inherently bad or bad in general. Now, the most obvious example would be that the comment is explaining the code. Now, the idea of self-documented code is that you don't have to read anything outside the code. You just read the code and you have the general idea what it does. In this specific case, split text takes text to split, it splits it to array. If you know what string split method does, and if you know the TypeScript annotation methods, you will get the full picture of it. You don't even need context. You don't even need to know who, when, why, etc. You just know that this function takes a string of text and it splits into array. That's it. So the comment above it is actually useless. It's even worse because it repeats what is happening inside this function, meaning that this is the same information served to you twice. It's at this point, this comment is just noise. And I remember a specific situation when for the open source repository, someone decided to gain some points in the eyes of the community and went through entire source code and actually added comments like that. He would take a simple function that, as let's say, adds two numbers together, and we'll just leave a comment. This function adds two numbers together, and we'll create a pull request and push it to repository. So that person was basically making that repository worse because again he was repeating the same information that you can get from reading this function. So this is one most egregious example, I would say, of all of the bad comments out there. The other one would be, yes, explain unnamed parameters. This is a more specific, I would say, but it stems from the fact that someone decided to create a function with a lot of parameters, so he has to explain them. Yes, in this specific case, well, method function takes three arguments. Yes, what is the first argument? Well, it's a number. What that number represents. What is it about? I don't know. You can, since JavaScript doesn't have named argument parameters of the functions, like you can understand those parameters, but only at looking at the source code. You can't go with like expand the slide timeout equals 200 because JavaScript doesn't work like that. So in this specific case, the user had to comment on all of these parameters because otherwise it would be hard without reading the source code to understand what it is. Now, this is a very specific example because here we are looking at the code that doesn't really need comments because it can be written in a way that doesn't require comments. Because we can replace all of those three parameters with one object. Object has keys with names, named keys, yes? So we can have a method, function expand the slide, that will take one argument, that is an object, and it has three keys: timeout, parent, type, or animation type. And with only that very little change, those comments are unnecessary, can be removed totally, and the user don't even have to read the source code. He can call the function, and in that function it will be more obvious what should be used. I mean, comments can still be usable because you can move them, for example, to the TypeScript interface and just comment on singular parameters, and that would be much better. But here still you don't need comments. You can just replace all of this with one object and you'd be much better end result. Now, the same goes for this. Now, this is also a pretty specific situation because changelog of who, when, why, what, etc. is basically a version control system, just in the text form inside the file. Now, versions control system are, I would say, not as a concept, they are not very old. The first, I'm pretty sure, I think was created either in 50s or 60s, pretty early, or maybe 70s, in that time period. So more than 50 years ago, I would say. But they were not that popular until programming in general become more accessible. Because I remember reading another book on programming, I don't remember the title at this point, where the author wrote an entire chapter about version control system and how we should use it, why we should use it, etc., etc. I've read that. I read that book I did read that book in 2020, I believe. So it had to be. I'm pretty sure it was also written after 2000. So it seems to me that the idea of version control system is a little bit still fresh for a lot of people, and because of that, changelog had its place before, when you had repositories without version control system, where you had to keep somewhere that information. But if you use Git, which is among us, at least until 2000, I mean, it was created in 2005, so it's at this point 17 years old. It's almost, I mean, he can drive, based on the US rules, he can drive what he can drink for another 4 years. So we have tools for that right now. So a comment that is a changelog basically is unnecessary at this point because we can move it somewhere else. And that, I don't know if you can see, but we have a little pattern here. We have comments that can be replaced by other tools. Comments that maybe were necessary in this form or that form years ago, but nowadays we can replace them with something better, with something that comes from the language itself, in case of the function arguments as one object, or by external tools, in this context with Git or something similar. So we can say that there is a set of comments that exist only for its own existence. The first example with explaining what functions do, and we have a set of comments that exist because there was nothing else around to replace them. But now there is, and since repositories with this kind of comments still exist, even though those can be replaced with those comments can be replaced with something else, people will probably read them and think about how comments are useless because someone used them in that way. What else? Well, quality of the code, yes, comments about that are not also unnecessary. There are funny compilations about comments like that. You can easily find them on the internet. There is, for example, a very nice an analysis of the first source engine code, the one that powers Team Fortress 2, for example. And in that code base, there are some not really nasty, but comments that show that the author of them were not in the best place when writing them, about, for example, implementations that were overly too complicated, etc., etc. And those are fun to read, but are not really that, at least once. But when you see them every day because someone decided to just leave them in the repository for the till the end of the time, yeah, those are not really the best. I mean, they are not harmful, but they are just noise. It's funny noise from time to time, but it's just noise again. Or this or those counters for people who are here to, I mean, counters like, if you are here to improve this code, please add your hours to the overall counter, because this code is impossible to improve. And at the bottom there is hours wasted 100 something like that. Yeah, those are, as I said, those are funny, but not really worth keeping in the code base. Now, yes, some people decided at some point that comments can be a little bit more, let's say, elaborate. So we can add a header, and we can add sections, and we can add something else that will look much better. So you open the file, you will see the EULA, or whatever, how you, EULA. I'm not really sure about the pronunciation. And then you will see explanation for that and the code somewhere at the bottom. And again, for the modern repositories, that is not really necessary, because you can always just link to those rules. You can add a separate file to repository. You have another ways of showing this specific information, but there are still cases where blocks like that have their merit. For example, there is a repository for the Command & Conquer Remastered. It's an open source repository. You can find it like this first result in Google. And that code was made in, I believe, 97 or 98. It's pretty old code. And the remastered version was based on that pretty old code. And basically every file at the top has this information: when it was written, by who, what is the purpose of that specific file, what are the variables, etc., etc. So in this specific situation, we are talking about very old code, where comments like that, like the introduction to that file, in the language that is already pretty hard to work with. In that specific case, I believe it was C++. That comment actually can help, because when you read that file for the first time, you can have zero ideas on what is going on and why. But for the more modern, I would say, repositories where you can express a lot of things in the code or in the files around the code, you don't really need decorations like that. You don't really need a README for the single JavaScript file. That would be just too much. You can have a source file in one place, and then you can have separate changelog and README and documentation instruction in separate place. Probably all in one Git repository, but separated. So those comments will be unnecessary in those cases. Yes, of course. And there is also just spam. Yes, just something that exists in the code base just because. It's even, I'm not really sure if it's worse or on the same level as code. I mean, as comments that explain the code. But I would say it's also somewhere there. It's something that should also not exist in the code, because comments that explain what the code does can have their place, can be useful, and for people who are new to the code base, they actually can do some good, because they can guide them through that code base. I believe that Redis code base has quite a lot of something that you can call an exploratory comments, which are basically comments that state that this part of code does this, and this method does this, and you read the, let's say, preamble, then you read the code, then another one, then another one. So you have something like an instruction to the code going through it. Of course, it's not really that useful for developers with some experience, developers that know the code base. But when you are a first timer, you open the Redis code base and it makes it a little bit easier to understand what is going on. But if you put jokes inside your code, if you put comments that are like private messages for someone that has nothing to do with the code, this is spam. This is just noise. This exists only to annoy people and should not even exist in the first place. I mean, it's fine if you go, if you have private repository, if you have some private code that you can mess around, then all the bets are off, or rules are just guidelines. You can do whatever. But the moment another person will starts working on that repository, you will have to do some changes, because otherwise, I mean, what's the point of even this comment exists other than a funny joke for you? So those are examples of comments that I think made people believe that comments in general are unnecessary. When you add on top of that Anker's Bob guidelines about clean code, the whole idea of a clean code, which is the code that is self-explanatory, does one thing and does one thing well, etc., etc. When you go with that mentality, then yeah, comments can be described as unnecessary or wrong or maybe even harmful. But there is quite a lot of examples of good comments, actually. I would say more than the bad comments, but just like with everything in this world, you have to dig through bad in order to find good examples. And because there is quite a lot of programmers there and quite a lot of code there, the chances, a chance for finding good comments out there are much smaller than the chance for finding bad comments. It's I believe this was Pareto principle. Okay. So what are the examples of good comments? So first of all, they will explain the reasoning behind the code. Now, this is a slide from the talk called "The Art of Code Comments." I stole the title for this webinar shamelessly from that talk, and also some points, talking points, and also this little screenshot. Now, if you look at the screenshot, what you're gonna see is basically a big long comment and one line of code. That one line of code can be basically invisible if you don't, if not for the formatting. Now, for all intent and purposes, you can say that this is spam, because why would you even write a comment that is this long? Like, can't you explain this code via code? Do you really have to write a little novel here? But the situation is that this is a comment about a bug fix, about a pretty specific problem that can't really be explained via code, because if you go for, as you can see, tooltip, because this is about React component tooltip, if you go with tooltip get_root styled pointer events, what does this mean? Like, what's the purpose of that? Why is it even here? Because if you remove all the comments and just leave that one line, I don't know about you, but I will just look at it and think to myself, do I really need that line? What's the purpose of that line? Can I just delete it? Etc. Which is already which are questions that I shouldn't even think about, because because this is a specific fix for a specific problem. This code exists here for a reason. The only thing that I needed is to read that reason, which is why this very long comment even exists. And it should exist. I mean, maybe it should be moved to a separate README file, for example, but it should be somewhere, because it explains why this line of code is even here. Without it, there is a good chance that this line will disappear in the next few years, especially when the person responsible for that line disappear, because there was quite a lot of situation in my career when I would try to fix some problems with my code, I would check git blame, and that code was changed, like, let's say 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and the person responsible doesn't work in that company anymore. The last he left like 2 years ago or something like that, and now and the rest of his team doesn't even know why this line is there anymore. Maybe someone left a little email somewhere. Maybe there was a little Slack message that is now buried under thousands and thousands more, but nobody knows. And without comment like that, I would be facing a dilemma. Should I remove this line? Should I leave it? Is it unnecessary? Is it necessary? Is it spam or something? What was the problem that this line fixed by the browser vendor, for example? There is a lot of questions here. But with comment like that, I would be sure to just leave it and move on. So explain the purpose, because if you explain the purpose, a lot of question will just drop dead at the spot. Now, what's the problem here? Thing is, codes are orders, and you can't really explain intent via orders. If you think about military, for example, yes, soldiers have their orders, but there is also a thing called briefing and debriefing, because it's one thing that you will give orders to your people and you will say do this and do that, but sometimes it's important to know why. Yes, it's important to explain why this specific order was issued, why this specific person has to carry that order. So this is why we use comments, and this is, I would say, the prime example of why comments are actually good, because there are situations, I would say quite a lot of them, where you can't really explain everything via code. Now, there's also an argument that if you can't explain yourself via code, then you won't be able to explain yourself via comments, because why would you? But then, just like with documentation, there is code is more like science, comments, and documentation more like art. Those are two different languages. So you can be better in one than another. You can also be good in both, but both of them have different intent behind them, different roles to serve. To use an example, I've been talking about games for some time. Let's use an example from the game. This is Warcraft 2 briefing screen for the orcs, I believe. Now, for the horde, actually. Now, what's the catch here? So, the orders, what the code does, is at the very bottom. Yes, the rest is why the code does what it does. Technically, you don't have to read any of this when playing Warcraft 2. You can just read objectives and continue, but you will lose all the context. Maybe we will have some questions. Maybe you will have some ideas. Very little idea what is going on. Some people don't need that. But I would argue that for the programming, you really need that. You really need to understand why parts of the code are this or that place and why they are the way they are. So, and as you can see, you can't really explain what is happening in the objectives box. There's just not enough space there. Will not. If you want, you can of course expand this box, but at this point, I can also ask why expand it when you can just use different tools to do its job. Which is why we have a differentiation between objectives and the description of the mission. And again, objectives in this case are code. We are talking machine what to do, and briefing for that mission, the explanation is our comments. This is the text for the user, because that's another thing. Just like with documentation is for people, code is for machines. Comments are also for people, and the code is for machines. Now, you can use also code to communicate with people, but as you can see, code is just instructions. It's just a list of things that the computer has to do. We can't really communicate with each other using this type of language, because we will lose quite a lot of context in the process. Okay, another good example of good comment. Yeah, it points towards specific use case. I worked in a project where we had to still support EA, I believe 6 at least. So we had, and there was a need for create a web worker or maybe a specific script. I don't remember exactly, but the idea was that function responsible for that specific piece of logic had 4 or 5 different if statements at the very beginning to check what exactly we can do, because different versions of EA had different APIs. So that method would go through every if, and based on that, the rest of the logic will run or not, because as I said, not every EA would handle that problem. And in our case, and when I first saw that code, I was like, what is that? What is the purpose? And someone was nice enough to leave some comments. So every if had a version of EA of Internet Explorer there, and why this specific part of the Internet Explorer API was targeted. So I could just go through all of this and be sure that all the basic cases were covered. So codes like that, very useful. Nowadays, maybe not so much, because vendors try, with the emphasis on try, to have similar APIs, to not break APIs, etc. But there are still situations when something will work on EA and at this point on Edge, but won't work for Firefox, or it will work for Firefox, but for some reason not for Safari, etc. And also we have situations like Safari, which can't be really upgraded. Like for Chrome, you will get higher and higher version every, I believe, 2 weeks at this point. Fine. But if you use older version of macOS or macOS, then sorry, you are locked to a specific version of Safari, and that version might not support what I want to do on my with my JS code. So comments like that in this specific situations would be very, very helpful. What else do we have? Yes, comments that tells what to do next in the code. Sometimes you just can't finish that piece of code. Sometimes you finished, but there are still things that you want to add later. Sometimes you actually you are working at this code right now and have to remember what to do next. So you put a little to-dos and you just fulfill them one by one. You can commit them. You can leave them in the repository for other people to understand. Those to-dos are a little bit weak because there is no explanation why. Although sometimes you don't really have to handle empty strings. It's I would say pretty obvious that if you have empty strings, you have to do something about use try catch, create new error, something like that. But yeah, this specific type of comments are very helpful for 2 types of people, for you specifically and for the rest of the team, because you know what to do with this code in the future, and they know, and they will know. Otherwise, if you would have that to-do list somewhere on your desk, you will have to, let's say, during pull request, write down that this part has to be expanded, this part has to be fixed, etc., etc. With comments like this, everyone are on the same page, and those can exist in the repositories for years and years, because sometimes a piece of code will just be left alone for quite some time. And it's good to know that there was a list of things that we wanted to do with this code, but had zero time for that, for example. Then maybe, since we are, and maybe if when someone is trying to rewrite this particular piece of code, he would see those tools and be like, okay, maybe I should add those. Or he would be like, are those to-dos even still relevant? Maybe I should remove them, etc., etc. So this is like a little piece of documentation, little piece of history, little piece, I would say, of development log for this specific part of the code. And because of all of that, it should stay in this place, because there is usefulness in this. There are comments like that are actually useful. They can actually help in this way or that. And that's actually the thing. Comments that are useful should stay. This is another example. This is a much more specific situation, but something that most people, I would argue, won't do, which is putting comments to Stack, links to Stack Overflow into the code. Because let's not kid ourselves. There are blog posts and posts on Stack Overflow or Facebook posts, etc., with explanations on how to do some specific things. And a lot of people, myself included, unfortunately, will just take that code, maybe modify it a little bit, and put it in the source code. And if I'm gonna need that code later, or maybe try to understand later what to do, what is the source of it, but because maybe I copied it wrongly, the link will be nowhere to found. So if there is a piece of code that was just taken from Stack Overflow or built based on some blog post, it's really good to put the link to that into the code for later use, just in case. Because I don't know, maybe in the future I would have to make some tweaks into the code. Maybe the original version was actually better and I made it worse, etc., etc. So in general, points to point towards source of the fix, of the change, etc., will be beneficial for the future, because again, this is like a little piece of documentation here. This is not only we are explaining where, but to some extent also why with this code benefits modified version, because. So it's a little look into developer's mind at the time. And another example, I believe it's the last one. And it's actually also very specific, but I believe it will gain more traction as the time goes on, because yes, this is the example of the Vue3 component. Vue3 components use method setup. It's basically one function that returns some variables that you can use in the template, but you can also use component lifecycle hooks there. You can use some external methods, etc. But basically, yeah, you are preparing component here. You return some data. You initialized some logic. What's the problem here? For the Vue 2, you will have separated sections with the options API for data, props, watches, etc., etc. With setup, you don't have that. You have to create your own structure. And in a situation like that, having comments to tell the another person that this place is where I create variables, and in this place I create computed variables, and in this place I handle lifecycle methods, etc., etc. You basically are telling yourself and other people where you are doing different parts of the logic, which, as I said, for the options API was pretty obvious. I mean, you can put different sections in different places in the code, so you can have data at the very bottom, for example. That won't be a problem. Here you have to have some kind of a structure, and that structure will also be pretty different for different people, because return has to be at the end, but everything before that is a free game. And the same goes for React components, for example, because functional components in React are also basically a function that returns something, so you can put data anywhere you want there in any way. Nobody says that you can't use state under use effect, for example, although you should do it differently. Svelte components are also basically like that, because and Svelte components are even worse, because you can have exports in Svelte components before anywhere in the code, because exports in Svelte components also work in a different way. They're about different purpose. So not having any comments in components like that is asking for trouble, because at some point you, especially with really big components, you can get lost a little bit. So the fact that you can just look at the code, look at the comments, and knew instantly that, okay, this section is about this section is about this, etc., makes this code much more readable. The same goes for tests or for some more complicated functions, because yes, you can technically split bigger functions into smaller ones, but there are situations where putting one line of code into a separate function that is used only in that one place and nowhere else, it might seem like a good idea, but it is basically time and resource waste, because instead of going through one file, reading that one line, and maybe a comment above it to clarify some things, you now have to find that one function, maybe in separate file, go to that file, read that function, and go back. You are switching context. In this specific case, very unnecessarily, because you can have all of that in one place. And the only difference is one little comment sometimes, if you really have to explain why you are doing some stuff. So yeah, if you have a situation where you can't really structure the code, or you have a situation when adding comments will actually provide some kind of a structure, this is a great way of using them. I would say this is one of two main reasons to use comments. One is to explain why the specific piece of code exists, why exists here, what happened to them, and why it happened. And the other would be to separate code into smaller parts, to explain why this part is in this place, why this part is in this place, what this part does, what this part does, etc., etc. Explaining the source of the fixes, explaining why some ifs are in the code. Yes, those are also important, but I would say structure of the code and why for the code are much more important. And those, I would argue, are the primary reasons why the comments even exist. Because yes, explaining what code does when you can do that via code is wasteful. Using comments to explain function arguments when you can just use objects is also wasteful. But there are situations when comments are helpful, like this one, when you can see what different parts of the setup are about, or when you have to or should explain why code exists in the first place. Because, as I said, sometimes there was a very specific reason. Person who created that code is not with us anymore. Person who decided to even create that comment is not with us, and you have to do something about it. So yeah, I would say those are the two primary reasons to write comments if you can't express something in the code. Because yes, basically you should express yourself via code as much as possible. And when that is not possible, just add some comment, explain why, make some split code into more readable structures. And that's would say basically it. Okay, are there any questions about this topic, about comments, about their usage, about specific, maybe specific use cases, etc., etc.? If you have something, then please, I'm listening. Okay, I believe there is nothing. Or no, I think there is nothing. Okay, so thank you once again for joining me in this lovely. Oh, I would say, yeah, I wanted to say evening, in this lovely day. This has been, yes, another the Vincent webinar, this one about comments, about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the comments. Please, if anything that you learned, that you heard today was in any shape, way, or form helpful to you, consider staying in touch with us. We have our official webpage, we have a LinkedIn profile, we have a Facebook profile, and there is also a YouTube page where you are already sitting where you are listening to my voice. So if you have to stay in touch, please visit those pages. Please subscribe to our newsletter. Please subscribe to our page. apart from webinars, we also have streams. We have some educational materials. All of them are in Polish, but there probably will be one day also in English. On the webpage, we have some blog posts, also in English, and link for LinkedIn and Facebook. We from time to time publish some materials that you might be interested in. So yes, if you feel that you learned something, anything, then please visit our workshops and leave like, subscribe, and all of this social media vocabulary. So again, thank you all for coming today to this webinar. I hope that you learned something about comments, about human readable language and programming in general. And I hope to see you and to hear from you all again next time. So once again, thank you, and till next time. Ciao, ciao.